Behind you is a photograph that you took in Afghanistan, and we're looking at a citadel that is reportedly from the time of Alexander the Great. And then over your shoulder is a vehicle from the Soviet invasion, 1979 through the 80s. And then you are there as a US Navy officer in Afghanistan. And so what I'm looking at here are three layers of invasion, three historical waves of invasion in Afghanistan for very different reasons. But I'm wondering, when you're in this part of Afghanistan and you see what you see, the Soviet vehicle there disabled and slowly disintegrating in the elements, the very, very old citadel behind you. Um, I'm wondering what kinds of thoughts went through your mind as now you're there in Afghanistan yourself as an officer.
Yeah, it's a great question because this materializing of history uh, really does touch on the sorts of intellectual questions I think we ask ourselves all the time about, "Well, what am I doing? How's it going to impact history?" This is some sort of physical reminders that history was all around us when we were there, and that we weren't the first non-Afghans, to traverse this territory with some ideas about creating peace and security.
Yeah. Um, Now you served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Let's focus at first on Afghanistan. When were you in Afghanistan?
I was there from 2008 to 2009. So, in the context of our actual engagement there, fairly early in the context of what we thought we were in when I was there, we always thought we were close to wrapping up.
What did that mean to you? Wrapping up meaning Afghanistan is not only going to have freedom, but enduring freedom, or wrapping up meaning just putting our stuff on the planes and going home?
We had a mission that focused on building capacity of the Afghan people to defend their own borders, to maintain internal security, to have that kind of stability to ensure that the Taliban or other regional warlords wouldn't create a safe haven for Al Qaeda, for other terrorist organizations. So that focus on, hey, these are the conditions we need to feel good about leaving was something we were working towards, very early at the time in the country. That strategic horizon of a handover in which what we brought to the table in terms of military capability would be something that the Afghans could carry themselves. That was a constantly moving horizon, like, any horizon is. Uh,
Did,
and so that's why it felt like, we were racing towards the end. We had a clear goal, but those goalposts were relatively defined, right? So they kept moving.
and is that because, let me ask the question and then I'll tell you why I'm pitching the question this way. Is that because you realize, and if you disagree with the premise of the question, feel free to say that as well, but is that because it occurred to you that the objective that you were given didn't really correspond with objectives that the Afghans had themselves? I ask this question because I've been talking with soldiers who are serving out in remote areas. What I'm hearing from them is that, they never got the feeling that the Afghans had a sense of Afghanistan as a nation, that they really cared very much about borders, that these things that are very important to people in the United States, to people in Korea, were not important to people in Afghanistan. So that leads me back to the question. I mean, you talk about the kind of the the goals that you had, implying these are goals that are difficult to achieve. Are they difficult to achieve because the Afghans didn't necessarily share the goals?
I think one of the things that's really impressive about Afghanistan as a place is its incredible diversity, both ethnically, tribally, even religious diversity. But the scope of peoples that sort of fall under this one, and the borders of Afghanistan were certainly influenced back in the Great Game of the 19th century between, Britain and Russia and others, and shaped throughout, its development over, a few hundred years by external powers. And so the reflection between their borders and that local sense of identity and desired autonomy amongst the Afghan peoples, uh, yeah, that tension between some ideal state and the politics that were local certainly, I think, was the graveyard of a lot of uh, big ideas and grand plans and schemes.
Hmm. Big ideas coming from people outside of Afghanistan.
I think so. I think the few times in which Afghanistan was a fairly stable polity, the degree of local control that a Kabul-based government actually had was quite small. We might think of it more like a confederation of fairly autonomous localities rather than a nation state where sort of the exclusive right to deadly force is held by a central government, and the control of the borders is only for national policy and not for sort of like local drug trade, or this is there are tribal ties on both sides of this arbitrary border, and there's been back and forth without customs enforcement for centuries. And that's certainly not going to start tomorrow.
Can you tell us what kinds of missions you would do, if you just sort of pick a given day, what sort of things might you do in Afghanistan?
I operated mostly at the strategic level, even though I was a fairly junior officer. uh, as Secretary Rumsfeld was fond of saying, you go to war with the army you have, and in this case the navy you have, because the army was pretty much tapped out at the tactical level. And so a lot of our more strategic level um, commands, like I was attached to the International Security Assistance Force, which was the umbrella organization that brought in the international coalition to stabilize the country. And I think that strategic level aperture meant that most of what I did was in a dark room with 3 or 4 computers and endless deadlines run locally. And then once the local requirements were fulfilled for the commanding general, then people in Washington, D.C. would wake up and start sending out all of their requirements, or Central Command down there in Tampa. uh, Whenever these time zones would light up, so would our communications channels. I went out and about to places like Farah and Herat, um, to do like more like local listening tours, talking to personnel that we had in those areas, because it's very difficult to write and analyze conditions without a sense of that yourself sort of in your bones.
Sure. And where were you based? Where did you spend most of your time? Where was this dark room that you've referred to?
Mostly the ISAF headquarters was downtown Kabul on an old Soviet base. So there was a lot of evidence of Soviet presence. It's sort of ironic that for like most of my tour, I was in a basement of an old, Soviet era building that was very cave-like, right? I mean, it's where we could, have a secure facility that we could sort of control access to. Uh, there's all sorts of, requirements around our classified systems. And this was one way we could fulfill that was in this basement, which was not really fit for human habitation. We made it work.
I mean, I don't know what it was like for you, but just hearing that you are operating from an old Soviet space, a space built by the Soviets, and now you're there doing your work. I mean, it sounds surreal, really. I mean, was there, do you remember discussions or was there a feeling? I guess the analogy in my mind would be, early on in Vietnam. Well, the French did not succeed here, but what do you expect? They're the French. Things will be different for us. Well, the Soviets did not succeed here, but their economy was unraveling and the people hated the Soviet system, and the Soviet system we know now was, on the verge of collapse. Of course, the conflict in Afghanistan helped push the Soviet Union that way. But the Soviets had a lot of problems, and but we're here, we're different, our economy is strong. We won't have the same kind of experience. I mean, do you remember those kinds of discussions or those kinds of thoughts? Like, well, of course the Soviets didn't succeed, we will, or the Soviets didn't succeed here, and I don't know how different things are going to be for us. Do you remember any of those kinds of thoughts as you're sitting in this room that the Soviets built?
Yeah, I mean, people thought about those things, occasionally discussed them. It's very difficult to have that sense of historical comparison, though. I mean, the Soviet objectives were different than our objectives, but
Sure.
again, this was an ISAF base, and so my experience at that time was incredibly international with Spanish and German. There were Turkish military there, the Italians. It was an interesting mix of folks who all had different histories. It was basically built largely on the NATO alliance, but there were other countries too. And one in particular that we had there were the Macedonians.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so the reference back to Alexander. Yeah.
Exactly. And ironically enough, during the second half of my tour, their main mission was ECP control. So they were there at the front gates. In one of the poems in my book, I talk about an IED at the gate, and that's the Macedonians were defending it. And yeah, the layers of history there are certainly ones that they're not hard to reach towards. We had Brits and Canadians and Australians. I worked for directly for an Australian colonel who was sort of embedded in um, our chain of command. Part of there's a internal alliance of five countries who share a lot of information at very high levels, and so
That the
uh,
Five Eyes,
yeah,
Five
so
Eyes countries.
exactly.
Do you have any, I'm interested if you have any thoughts about kind of the different spirits that these military personnel from different countries had. I mean, the US, simultaneously has Iraq going on. Australia's in Iraq with us, but a lot of the countries who are in Afghanistan with us were opposed to what was going on in Iraq, had opposed the invasion of 2003. Do you have any memories of interesting exchanges with military personnel from other countries, kind of about the general question of Iraq and Afghanistan and the whole war on terrorism?
I think those weren't topics that we discussed, between countries. There was pretty much a agreement on the party line of, well, I shouldn't call it the party line, the national lines of what our national leaders had said. And that's the thing about soldiers, regardless of the country, we understand that our role is the stability of the civilian governments that lead our own countries, and therefore we are not there as policymakers for those countries. We are there to ensure that the fabric of our own society, the ability of our governments to determine, as led by our peoples, these are largely democratic, allies of ours, um, that we did the job they sent us to do according to the principles and rules that they established what we chose to measure was an expression both of what we valued, but also what people would then begin to pursue separate from whatever good it actually was meant to represent. And so, you know, if you're supposed to measure stability by the number of violent events that happen in a district, right? And that's what you're counting, how many attacks were there, how many IEDs, this or that. Well, one way to ensure that that number goes down is to just stay on base.
The obvious problem
Which
being if you just stay on base, though, you can't really pursue the mission, right?
exactly, you can't pursue the mission. You don't really have a sense of what the, what that space is, ceding space to whatever other actors there are in your locality. And just because things aren't blowing up doesn't mean that there's not all sorts of influence being exerted at night or covertly around corners, or even overtly, with payoffs and things of that nature. So I think the danger of you've got to measure, you've got to have some way of knowing, what are we trying to accomplish and what are the benchmarks of how we get there.
What I'm hearing you say is that, and I don't mean this in a cynical way, but the policymakers will be happy if the numbers of bad incidents decline, because they could say things are going well because the numbers of bad incidents are declining, which makes sense as an argument. But then you have the follow-up point, but bad incidents are declining because we're not going out there and pursuing the mission, right? Which is to get involved in the society and to, we have the hearts and minds programs and we're trying to take it to the terrorists and that kind of thing. Is that a fair paraphrase of what you just said?
Sure, and the reverse metric is also true. There were times in which, no, the number of fighters or foreign fighters, right, that we take off the street. That's the metric we want to be measuring, and without sort of any consideration of how a higher operation tempo could actually be a more effective recruiting tool for our enemies, and that it would bring more fighters onto the field as well. So it's a really kind of a sticky problem, and how one measures it really has a lot of second and third order implications for how the battle space itself will change.
So what I'm hearing, and I'm the wheels are turning. What I'm hearing is that this is a very complicated situation. I'm not sure that our leadership understood in 2001 how complicated the situation was going to be, but it sounds like you're getting a taste of what a very, very complicated situation this is in a country where, as we've said, a lot of folks don't even have a conception of the nation of Afghanistan. How would you just describe Kabul? I mean, were you able just to, if you wanted to go for a walk through the streets of Kabul, were you able to do that? Were you free to do that?
No, not at all. It was not considered a secure environment. Uh, and the only times people would sort of like leave the base would be in civilian clothing. There was still quite a large expatriate community in Kabul around Afghanistan, maybe aid workers, the uh, State Department types, from the various countries. And so it wasn't, we weren't free, to walk uh, off the base. Occasionally, a bazaar would come to us. It would set up in a more secure location where you could go out and get, some more locally cooked food, uh, things like that.
If I understand your work, then a lot of your work involves gathering information from the field and writing reports about that and then submitting those reports. Do I have that basically right?
Yeah, I would describe it more as, advising senior decision makers on, issues of military and national concern. I'm a reserve officer. And what that means is that I'm drawn from the civilian side of America's power base. The reserve part of the military is seamed throughout American society. You just don't know who you're going to get when you call up, people from the reserves and send them. And that's how we fought these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was relying very heavily on the reserve. This is part of military doctrine post Vietnam, to ensure that there was, support of the American people. And so one of the things, that sort of stuck out to me, and, I try and capture these thoughts in my poems, is there's one called Care Packages, and it's about the nature of the relationship between old grannies in, Minnesota, or knitting, like a cap to wear to keep the, soldiers warm. And of course, if it's not a uniform item, we're not going to wear it.
Mm, sure.
Like it's
Yeah.
something we have, like there's opportunities to wear, civilian clothes or something like that. And so these things would come in in care packages. And we had, for a while the opportunity to go out and do um charitable work, like go to orphanages, and we would bring like the candy that would come in boxes, and things like that were imagined that were supporting the troops. But in fact, the troops were like, the people who need this are the people uh,
People in
of,
Afghanistan.
of Afghanistan. And it was an incredibly intimate sort of point of connection as I thought about, right, what this granny was thinking as she knit this cap, and how that was going to make a material impact, on the life of some kid or somebody else who would have, just a little bit more warmth, because they were burning excrement, they were burning shit just to stay warm. And that was certainly an aspect of our life, is the amount of ash that fell on us. That really was from excrement.
So the care packages that came in, I remember a line from your poem, addressed to, any, any military service member, something like
Yeah. Any soldier, airman,
that.
Marine, sailor.
That stuff would come in, and a fair bit of it, in your experience, would then be passed on to Afghan people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, how many Jolly Ranchers can you actually eat?
Right. You served in Iraq to 2022, 2023. Um, and people have a an awareness that there are still Americans over there in that part of the world. Um, but obviously Iraq, most people think of Iraq in historical terms, that war that ended some time back. Again, I imagine that there are limitations on what you can say, but how would you describe your, just given your experience, what you saw, 2022, 2023, how would you say things were going at that time in Iraq?
All politics are local, all always a sort of understanding growth and stability of a government, very hard to assess from the outside. I mean, a lot of times people will look at the American political system and see a lot of dysfunction, right? A lot of parties that are sort of intractably opposed to anything the other party brings up, and this can lead to stagnation or a gridlock in governance. Well, that's certainly what was and often is happening in Iraq. I mean, it's again, it's a complicated environment where you have at least three different large ethnic and religious groups, with a more or less a power sharing agreement, which can lead to some surprising alliances, but oftentimes it's a lot of gridlock. And so Is that a democratic success? Well, I can't be a hypocrite and say that, we get a lot done. Um,
Mhm.
but there were certainly, I certainly had a lot more closer calls, in terms of my physical safety in Iraq than I ever had in Afghanistan. And I was still on incredibly tiny little base in the downtown of the national capital. But the conditions around us, I mean, we had such a small footprint of, forces that, the standoff distance for anyone who wanted to bug us was just much smaller.
By bug you, what does that mean? Mortar shells coming in, or
No, not mortars. Usually they like rockets. Uh, although drones, certainly are a growing threat in that area. The base that I was on there in Baghdad is one that the United States had security of for, over 20 years. And it's now a joint base with the Iraqis. It's got their national headquarters for their military. It's still a small little postage stamp of a base, uh, but it is has a few thousand U.S. and international troops, as well as a contingent of Iraqi forces. More explicitly a NATO mission. In fact, there is NATO mission Iraq. Has representations for pretty much all NATO countries, as well as, ones like Sweden, who, are partners of NATO, even as their membership is still in process. About 600 strong at the time that I was there. And their focus, just like U.S. forces, is on building capacity within the Ministry of Defense. So think long-term training. I mean, part of what makes our military so effective is that we have a pipeline of training and development for our sailors and soldiers and airmen that bring them through the course of a career to really high levels of proficiency. And if you're dealing with an army of conscripts, or drawing out of a population base that doesn't have a lot of access to education, your military is going to have to provide a whole lot of development for people. And then if your weapon systems are drawing on, pretty complicated technologies, there's another level of training that's going to be needed. It's not simply a matter of here's the manual, push here, to make this light up. That's inadequate for, any kind of usage or maintenance. So it's a massive undertaking to pass on military capacity and expect it to last more than, the first maintenance cycle.
you're not out walking the streets of Baghdad?
Oh no, no, the streets of Baghdad were for the Iraqis. There was, you lots of appointments that people would have, for training and consultation at different sort of bases or government offices around the greater Baghdad area. And so there were daily missions where people would, go and interact with their Iraqi counterparts. But we weren't there, and the U.S. forces there and the NATO forces there, they weren't providing security directly. We were in an advisory role, a true advisory role, in which the people who really had the sort of the face to face with the Iraqi people were Iraqis.
Um, and was your work in Iraq similar to what you did in Afghanistan? Sort of gathering information and then using that to help policymakers make decisions?
Yeah, I had a much more international team in this environment. So, people from Slovakia, Czech Republic, Turkey, um, Spain, lot of Spaniards, the Dutch. It was quite an alliance. I did a lot of training, as you might imagine,
Yeah.
as a career officer at this point. I'm a little more senior than I was when I was in Afghanistan, and so a lot of the countries would send people who they wanted. Like, so we were building capacity for Iraq, but in the process of doing that, I think the NATO country interest was also, developing the capacity of their own people.
This comes from the title poem in the book. And you write here of men sick in the passenger seat of a Humvee, head on a swivel for every fresh pile. And that sticks in my mind because of things I've heard from soldiers and Marines who were in Iraq. What goes through your mind, or what was going through your mind when you wrote those words?
Yeah, movement is always the period of greatest threat, but air conditioning doesn't always work great, and you can't roll down the windows because they're bulletproof,
Mm.
and you're cramped, you're in armor, you're in all your gear, so good luck if you got any kind of motion sickness issues. You don't really have time for that. But head on a swivel, right? You're looking, you're scanning. Yeah, because IEDs can be emplaced, anywhere. And there was always sort of like knowing which seat in the Humvee is going to be yours, and the least essential personnel get to be behind the um the passenger side, back seat, and that's usually where you put your people who aren't going to like fight the vehicle, so people like me who were just like, I was getting a ride. So
Oh, wow, yeah,
that's where you end up.
wow. And now I imagine that this is relevant to getting around in Afghanistan. Is it also relevant to getting around in Iraq when you do have to leave the base and go somewhere? Is there that same sense that you have to be very cautious and very aware of what's going on, Iraq 2022, 2023?
There's a lot more movement through the city now, and the at different periods of the U.S. engagement in Iraq, it was pretty easy for forces that would want to disrupt our movement to plant IEDs in places they knew we would go.
Mm.
You can't you can't
Right.
really do that in a modern urban environment now. It's still of course a concern. There were a few IEDs that were in place during my year there, but no US or international um, uh, coalition casualties from them, during that time. More the issue for us was more like rockets and drones and things like that.
I think the background here is that a police officer pulled you over, you were speeding. Police officer gathered that you serve in the Navy. He says his brother's also in the Navy in Afghanistan, and there's the exchange. Here's what you write. Turns out his brother is deployed. Navy, Kabul. A few questions later, I figure where he's at. I was there last summer. Not a tidy place when the south wind blows. And then I skip several lines. The base is only bad when suicides assault. And then the police officer decides to let you go without writing a ticket.
One of the things that is lost when people talk about only 1%, right, of people are currently serving in the military, or veterans, is the way in which we're sort of connected to all of our fellow citizens. And so, yeah, why the cop let me go is he had, a brother. And there was this point of connection where what he was worried about is, something that I had experienced. But knowing what are things really like over there? That's a question people would ask me all the time. And that particular line, oh, it's not bad, except when suicides assault the gate. That there's a couple of things going on there. I mean, obviously there's suicide bombers, and the way in which that is a threat, to people, even in an otherwise secure environment. Um, but the only dead body I ever saw in Afghanistan was the body of a person who had killed himself.
Mr. Petraeus, your counterinsurgency tools could only work in countries we didn't create. Republics not birthed by death from above. The dissertation is final proof that intelligence and gulled innocence in general betray us. I'm interested in hearing you respond to that in general, but I did especially focus on those words, intelligence and gulled innocence betray us. It's an interesting contrast there. Um, High capacity for gathering intelligence alongside gulled innocence, which I'm translating as a kind of cluelessness. I'm interested in what responses you have.
I think we can miss a lot of the big picture by, how much we are able to know or gather. I mean, this is what I do for a living, uh, not just in the military, but I also, study people through literature, and we can know a lot, and that's not the same as being able to control people or a situation. Gold innocence. I mean, there is a sense in which we're an incredibly idealistic people, and when we're told we're going to go do good, we believe it because we want that, and we have a really big heart. But we're easily um, betrayed in that, because um, the methods that we adopt may not lead to the results that are claimed. The the situation of being an outside reader on this doctrine, this does become, the Army's counterinsurgency field manual. Even though this is a poem, I also wrote an essay on the same topic, really examining under what conditions does counterinsurgency doctrine make sense. Where is it something that can be successful? And you really do have to have a local partner with some legitimacy.
Your Congress wants to hear about the war. Scrubbing firefights is now your chore. Bury ones where we shot first, or you'll scare the aides who count the way they did before. Listing casualties by month makes more of them than using weeks, and that's not fair when Congress wants to hear about the war. Green on blue is new, so just ignore those dead when they don't fall in columns where you're told to count the way they did before. I was especially struck by the reference, or by the line, listing casualties by month makes more of them than using weeks. And then the reference to green on blue.
Yeah, that poem comes out of one of my darker times when I was in Afghanistan, where it had, a typical 18-hour day. Someone shows up with um an forwarded email, like, oh, we've got to get this, assessment, report turned around in the next day. And it was all of these questions, and it's, congressional oversight is a serious matter. Um, but they asked questions that we weren't measuring. And like we had no data to answer the types of questions that they were asking. Maybe, people had collected that type of data in the way that they wanted it. But like, if all you have is, processed data. You can't go back and disaggregate it into the components and then reaggregate it into the shape that they were asking. So anyhow, that was like, after, 9 months of 18-hour days, I was like, yeah, no, this isn't gonna happen. This is the issue we were talking about earlier about, the metrics you choose really matter. And, much of what this particular poem focuses on is that how we measure success, uh, and how we grade our performance, left out the human element. And that's why, it's a villanelle, so it has certain repeated lines, which is about, counting the way you did before. But that's why it ends with, no, you count, right? You who are in this cog in this wheel, you count the way that our casualties did before. People count, and what we sacrifice as a country is all of those lives that are incomplete, all of those communities in which they left a hole. And that's a type of counting that tends to happen in those families and in those communities where those gaps are noticed, where those lives have been lost. And to have a larger national accounting for that, I believe, would change how we assess the use of war as a tool for national policy.
So listening to you, and I have the phrases, bureaucratic counting, human counting, spiritual counting, and these are very different ways of counting, right? The
Oh yeah,
bureaucrats
absolutely.
just want the hard figures. Spiritual counting or accounting. It sounds like that's more what you're calling for. We've got the numbers, we've got the numbers, and the numbers are related to the human cost, but the human cost is much greater than the numbers.
Exactly.